next round. I want to move to foreign policy. The question is for you, Mr. Meek, and it's very simple. Do you think the war in Afghanistan can be won? How do you define victory? And do you believe that President Obama should begin withdrawing troops next July, even if that victory hasn't been achieved?
I think it's very important to note the discussion is going on right now to trying to find some sort of truth between the Taliban and Afghans are very, very important. I think some of the minerals that have been found by the U.S. military should be commended and should be a part of this discussion. Going after Osama bin Laden is very, very important. Need to be captured, killed, what have you. The intelligence that we have picked up, on the ground intelligence, is very, very important. But I think the redeployment of our men and women in middle of next year or the beginning of next year is pivotal. Every time,
even
George,
if there is no victory, and how do you define
it? Well, the question is defining victory. Is it killing Osama bin Laden? Is it making sure that we bring about the Taliban and capture all of the individuals that are involved? It's a very slippery slope. But one thing I do know, George, is that we have military families that are here, even many military families that live within Florida, that need their loved ones back home, that want their fathers back home, want their mothers back home. No one really thinks about them in this process. And as I've ran for the United States Senate since January of '09, I have encountered a number of military families saying, sir, and I served on the Armed Services Committee 6 of my 8 years on the Armed Services, in Congress. And I talk to these individuals, and they're real live, breathing individuals, and they're concerned about the fact that we clap for them when they walk through the airport. But who's clapping when these guys and gals are sitting in VA centers throughout the state of Florida waiting 2 hours for care? And that's what we have to think about when we think about this whole issue of war and how we find a responsible redeployment.
So just to be clear, because I want to get a response from Mr. Rivera, redeployment begins next July, regardless of conditions on the ground.
Well, our allies will be redeploying at that time, too. And I think it's very important that we start looking at that.
Just first thing, the Congressman is absolutely right. We first need to thank and congratulate our troops and express our gratitude, because you're absolutely right. These are the bravest and finest young men and women that our country has. Our family knows this firsthand. My brother was Special Forces Army during the Vietnam era, and that we know the strain that puts a family through. That being said, the war in Afghanistan is extremely important that we be successful. And this is how we define success, I believe. It's by providing a level of security on the ground, which I think General Petraeus and the President are going to be successful at doing, if they commit themselves to doing it, as I believe that they and hope that they have, to provide a level of security on the ground so that the Afghan people can establish for themselves a government that functions and create institutions and civil society that work. And let me explain why that's important. Number one, we don't ever want Afghanistan to ever again become a base of operations for the Taliban or any terrorist. But even more frightening is that Afghanistan could become a base of operations to destabilize Pakistan. And Pakistan is a nuclear power. It's a nuclear state. And the notion that Pakistan could fall into the hands of a Taliban-like regime is absolutely unacceptable. And that's why it's so critical that we succeed in Afghanistan.
I think we all can agree that we have a deep and abiding and appropriate respect for the people who serve in our military. Florida is a state that has a significant number of military bases, more than 20 installations throughout Florida. We have a Department of Veteran Affairs in my administration, and I'm very proud that former Leroy Collins was serving in that before he was tragically killed recently. It is important, I think, for us to realize what the question being posed is. What's happening in Afghanistan? Is it being successful? Is it appropriate to remove the troops next summer? I think that all of us have agreed that General Petraeus is an excellent military leader. I know him personally. I've had the opportunity to get to know him when he was based in Tampa. I think it was the right move for the President of the United States to put him in place after General McChrystal left. I also think it's important that success is defined by security. It's defined by safety. The first line of our Constitution, and our Founding Fathers talked about it, was that the duty of government is to ensure domestic tranquility. That's what's being talked about here. We have to make sure that nuclear weaponry does not expand around the globe. First and foremost, we have to make sure that that doesn't happen in Iran with Ahmadinejad. He's a madman, and our responsibility and our duty as a friend and ally to Israel makes it incumbent upon us to keep our attention and monitor the situation there as well.
I want to move on, but let me just make sure we clarify the differences here. You say redeployment begins next July. Basically,
we have the discussion of redeployment in the beginning of first quarter, second quarter of next year. As these two gentlemen mentioned, security is very, very important.
And you want to pursue success. You say reassess at that time.
No, I don't. I think the artificial timeline that's been set up...
That's what I'm saying.
Is, no, I think it undermines our mission. I think the enemy knows... If the enemy knows when you're going to leave, how can you be successful?
So he supports a timeline. You're against
I do not.
the timeline.
I think an artificial timeline is false.
I think it's appropriate for the President, the Commander-in-Chief, to let the American people understand when he wants to achieve that success. And if at that time, in concert with the discussion and advice and counsel of General Petraeus, they feel it's the right time to come home, then that should be done.
You'll follow General Petraeus' recommendation. Okay, let's move on.
Mr. Rubio, as you know, we're developing a high-speed rail that would link Orlando and Tampa Bay into one of the largest economic markets in the world and clearly create jobs. But you also want to cut discretionary non-defense spending back to the levels of 2 years ago. How can we possibly have both, or are you willing to tell the folks here in Florida, right here, right now, that if you win, high-speed rail may have to wait?
Well, let me tell you this. There's no shortage of good programs you can spend money on. You can come up with a long list of things the federal government can spend money on and worthy projects, but nothing is more important than dealing with this long-term debt issue. It is simply unsustainable. And that's not just me saying it. That's the president's advisors telling him that this long-term debt problem our country faces is simply unsustainable. And that's a priority over virtually everything else our country faces. In fact, the national debt is not just a domestic issue. Even people like Hillary Clinton and the leading military commander in this country have said that the national debt has a significant national security component, that our enemies dream of a Greece-like day of reckoning for America as much as they do another 9/11. So this national debt issue has to be confronted and solved. It is perhaps the predominant issue facing our country along with economic growth.
And at the expense of high-speed rail, it would leave us with a down payment with a rail line to nowhere.
Well, again, that's the problem with the decisions that have been made in Washington up to this point. And that they are going to borrow money that we don't have and leave the IOU to our children and our grandchildren, something that no generation of American has ever done. And again, it's another example of the dramatic choice in this race. If you like that kind of behavior from Washington, D.C., if you think Washington is placing us in the right direction when it comes to debt spending, then you're probably not going to vote for me. You should vote for Congressman Meek, whose voting record is identical to Nancy Pelosi's. You should vote for Governor Christ, who is willing to go along with all those sorts of things if it's politically expedient. But if you want your next U.S. Senator to be someone that will stand up and say, look, this national debt issue is the most serious issue we face and we must solve it, I'm the only one running that's going to do that.
Let me tell you, when you're the governor of a state the size of Florida, the fourth largest state in the country, and you realize that a couple of years ago the economy literally fell off a cliff, you have to lead and you have to strike a balance. That's leadership. Now, when the president came to Fort Myers, I was proud to go there and welcome him to my state for the first time since he had been sworn in as president. We needed the funds that were allocated in order to keep us from losing jobs. As I said earlier, 20,000 educators in our state would not have employment if that hadn't happened. 60,000 additional Floridians tonight, maybe watching this show, wouldn't have a paycheck coming to their home. The high-speed rail, Craig, that you mentioned, we worked on very hard in our administration. 3 different times I called a special session to get it done. Fortunately, the third try was the charm. That gave us an additional $1.25 billion, the down payment that you mentioned, of Florida tax dollars that had gone to Washington that I fought to get back here for our fellow Floridians to improve our transportation. Every time $1 billion is spent on infrastructure, the argument is that it will create 28,000 new jobs for people. It's all about jobs, jobs, jobs. And I understand you have to have a blend of these things in order to do what's right, and that's called leadership.
Mr. Meek?
Again, George, I'm glad that we're having this debate here tonight so Floridians can see who stands on solid ground. I think Mr. Rubio means what he says. The fact that he's willing to make sure that people from Tampa to Orlando to Daytona to South Florida sit in traffic for the next 20 years. He wants to make sure that he stands up on behalf of the right-wing ideology that he stands on. Charlie Crist stands on a wet paper box as it relates to the issues that he stands for, because you don't know where he is. And he did not provide the leadership to bring those resources back here. I'm the only candidate that actually stood up and voted for the stimulus to make sure that we did not go into a depression, to bring a floor so that we could stop the recession. To be able to stop the depression from taking place. I think it's very, very important that we understand in this race that high-speed rail will create over 20,000 jobs for this state. This is where the rubber meets the road. Marco Rubio just said that he would stand with Dick Cheney and George DeMint, Senator DeMint, and all of these right-wing members of Congress and the federal government, once upon a time, speaking of Dick Cheney, that he's willing to stand with them. He's not willing to stand with those construction workers that are sitting at home right now. He's not willing to take a stand on comprehensive immigration reform that will make sure that individuals that are here undocumented, that they no longer take the jobs from those that are citizens and those that are residents here in this country.
Sorry, but we've got to get to the final round.
Important we look at this.
This question is for Governor Christ. We are one of the few states in Florida that have a ban on gay adoption. It's been long-standing. You supported that ban, saying at one point that you believe traditional mother and father to adopt is best. The appeals court recently found that to be unconstitutional, right. And you called that decision great, and you've stopped enforcing the ban on gay adoption. Would you clarify for the voters what your position is on two things, gay adoption in Florida and the don't ask, don't tell policy in the armed forces?
Be happy to. And this is very important. You're talking about individuals' lives, how they live their lives. Some people in Washington on the radical right want to tell people who they should love and who they shouldn't. DeMint was raised by, Senator DeMint was raised by Congressman Meek, and he talks about who should be able to teach our children and who shouldn't, based on their sexual persuasion. That's unconscionable. That man, Senator DeMint, first guy who endorsed our opponent, Marco Rubio. That's where he's coming from, that part of the party, that extreme, radical, right part of the party. What we need to have is common sense and what's right for the child. When I was saying that it wasn't appropriate to have that adoption, it was because that was the law in the books in our state. I was the Attorney General of Florida. I understand enforcing the law and respecting it. And you're right, when the court changed it, they changed it by a district court of appeal. A 3-judge panel unanimously changed it and said, that law is unconstitutional. Well, that is in line with what I talked about when I ran for governor, even in the Republican primary, that I'm a live and let live kind of guy. You want to know where I stand? I am a fiscal conservative and a social moderate. I really believe in less government and more freedom. I don't want to impose my will on other people. Even though I'm pro-life, I vetoed that bill that would have required an ultrasound. But I also understand that we need to live within our means. I'm the only guy at this table who can do that.
Mr. Rubio.
Well, first of all, I think it's always funny to listen to the governor attack me for positions he himself held just 6 months ago when he was trying to be the biggest conservative in the world and win the Republican primary. I think that's the first thing we need to point out. The second thing we need to point out is that the governor talks about leadership when he was the governor, or has been the governor of the state of Florida. Governor, virtually everything in Florida is worse off today than it was 4 years ago when you took over. 800,000 jobs have been lost since you took over as governor. 200,000 of them were lost since you supported the stimulus. Florida was once one of the strongest economies in the country. Now only California and Nevada are worse off. And you broke your pledge never to raise taxes last year when you signed a bill that raised $2 billion in new taxes and fees. Those are the facts. The other thing that all this discussion brings to mind and to light is the dramatic choice that we have here in Florida. It appears that for every problem America is facing, the solution that Kendrick Meek and Charlie Crist offer is either a government spending program or a tax increase. Virtually every problem a country faces can be solved by a tax increase or a government spending program, according to them. I don't stand for that. And if you want a U.S. senator that believes in that, then you're going to vote for one of them.
Just to clarify, I think it's important to note that I am the only candidate sitting here at this table that's endorsed by the pro-choice community because I am a pro-choice policymaker. I am the only candidate that has stood up for the middle class and will continue to stand up for the middle class. The reason why I'm going to win this race is the fact that everyday Floridians can identify with me. It's really mind-boggling. It's beyond an explanation for the governor to stand here and do more than the Potomac two-step. I mean, he is saying that he was the, how would you say, the George Governor Wallace when it came down to gay adoptions in this state. For all of the kids that are in foster care right now that are looking for homes, he said he thought it was inappropriate. When he ran against Jim Davis in '06, he said that Jim Davis didn't have the values that he possessed. That's not in the state statute. That's his opinion. You need a leader that's going to stand on behalf of the people of the state of Florida in a time of need, not when it's politically convenient for them. Marco Rubio has raised another good point here. The fact that he's willing to go along with the Tea Party and everyone else that's on the radical right on issues versus standing with Floridians.
I got to stop you there. We have less than a minute left, but he just called you Governor Wallace. I want you to take 15 seconds to respond.
Well, my name's
I
Governor
didn't call him
Crist.
Governor Wallace. I just said that he stood in the schoolhouse door on this issue, and for him to turn around and say,
am I the one that gets to answer this,
great?
George?
Let him answer.
Great.
Listen,
come on,
nobody's
get
fought
out of
harder
here.
for minorities in this state than I have.
has
I
nothing
fought
to do
for
with
civil
minorities,
rights change
Governor.
on law.
Has
I'm
nothing to do with it.
Just
I'm
talking
just saying
about
that you
he
stood
talked about
firm on this issue of gay adoption, and now you want to be the biggest cheerleader for gay adoption.
Literally 10 seconds.
I hope the people at home understand what's going on here. If you want somebody on the far right, you got Marco Rubio. The far left, you have Kendrick Meek. If you want somebody who wants to fight for you and apply common sense, I'm your guy.
This is really interesting.
We could go on for all night, but we have 15 seconds left. Gentlemen, thank you all very much. It was a stimulating debate. Thank you, my colleagues here. For all of us at ABC News, have a good night. Weigh in on what you saw tonight on abcnews.com. We'll see you later.
Hey, all right.